In this lecture, we'll write our first console application, or console app. So the first thing we do when we're getting ready to program is we pick which programming language we're going to use. And because C# is the programming language of choice when we program Unity games, we're going to use C# throughout this course and the other courses in the specialization. Once we've picked a programming language, we pick an integrated development environment, or IDE, some place where we can actually type in our code, which is often called source code, in the programming language we've picked, and where we can run our code and debug our code if we have bugs in our code, and so on. The integrated development environment that we'll use throughout this course and the courses in the specialization is Visual Studio Community, which is free. So the way this process works is we type in our source code in our programming language of choice, and then we build the code, and then we run the code. And let's look at how that works in a little more detail for C#. So what happens is we start with our C# program, or our C# source code, and we run the compiler on it. And the compiler is a piece of software that converts that C# source code into what's called Common Intermediate Language. After we have our Common Intermediate Language, when it's time to actually run the code somewhere, the .NET Common Language Runtime takes that CIL, or Common Intermediate Language, and turns it into the actual machine instructions that will run on the chip on that particular computer it's running on. So we type our source code into Visual Studio, and then we build our code to generate the Common Intermediate Language, and then when we run our code, the runtime system actually executes our code. Let's go see how all this works in Visual Studio. When we start up Visual Studio, we have the option to open projects that we've used recently, or we can create a new project, and that's what I'm going to do. And it will pull up our recent project templates, and we want to create a C# console app. If your recent project template doesn't show up over here, you can search the templates up here, and if you search on console app, you'll get a hit for C# console apps, so you can select it from there as well. But once you've been doing C# console apps for a while, it'll appear over here and you just click it to select it and say next. And now we're going to enter a project name for our project, and I'll call this First Console App. And you get to pick where you want it to go. I pretty typically just use the default location and click next again. And here you get to pick which framework you want to use for your project. If you click this drop down, you'll see that you can pick .NET Core 3.1 or 5.0 or 6.0. And I'm going to pick 5.0, and we'll talk about why I do that before we finish the lecture. But for now, just pick 5.0 and click create, and it will create a new project for us. This is our standard template for a console app, and we'll talk about what each of the sections means. So on line 1, this is called a using directive, and system is called a namespace. So people write lots of code that we can use without writing it ourselves, just by using the namespace that those people have included the code in. So C# has lots of namespaces that have pre-built code that we can use, and once we start using the Unity engine has a bunch of different namespaces with code that we can use. So by including this using directive for specific namespaces, we make it so we can actually use the code that they provided. On line 3, when we create a new project, we actually get a new namespace for the files that are in our project, and the name of our namespace is just the name of the project that we picked when we created the project. We'll learn more about classes when we talk about classes and objects, but this particular class lets us group a bunch of code in between this open curly brace and this close curly brace. I'm going to add above this class name what's called a documentation comment. So if I put 3 slashes, I automatically get this comment in XML, Extensible Markup Language. And the reason this is useful is we can use tools to actually generate documentation from our documentation comments, which is really great if we want other people to use the code that we've created. They can use the documentation we can generate to actually figure out how to use the code. We're not really going to develop code for other people to use in the courses in this specialization, but getting into the habit of putting documentation comments into your code is a really good thing to do. For my documentation comment here, I'll just put first console app lecture code, and then we move down to line 10. And this big long line here defines what's called a method. So our method name is main, and methods are chunks of code that get executed by being called from somewhere. This particular method, the main method in our console app, actually gets called by the operating system when we run the code, but we'll write tons and tons of methods that actually get called from other places. And regularly we'll be calling those methods ourselves. But sometimes they'll get called from the Unity engine and so on. We'll learn lots about what each of these words mean as we start writing our own methods. The other interesting point of this method is between these parentheses, we have some information that gets passed into the method when it gets called. I'm going to add documentation above the method as well. And again, I'll just say first console app lecture code. And I'll provide a comment for these arguments as well. I happen to know that these are command line arguments. So if we actually ran this code from the command line in a command prompt window, we would have the capability to actually pass in command line arguments as well. That may seem like it's never useful at all, but it actually can really be useful if you write tools that do some processing on your game projects or the assets in your game projects or something like that. So that might feel like an outdated thing that we never need to do, but we actually will regularly do that if we write command line tools to do sort of batch processing of our projects. Finally, this method will execute, when it's called, all the code that appears between this open curly brace and this closed curly brace. So at this point, in our default template for a console app, we have a single line of code that will print hello world. And I might as well show you how that works right now. And I'll do that by running the code. And you can do that by coming up to this top menu bar and selecting debug, start without debugging, or you can use Control F5. So I'm going to use Control F5 to run my code, and it brings up this command prompt window and it says hello world. Now your command prompt window probably doesn't have a white background with the black letters on it, and you can read the instructions in the book that I provided in the week 1 reading to see how you can actually change the characteristics of your command prompt window. And I'll just exit. So let's actually change this code. I don't want to console write line hello world. I'm going to print some other message. So I'll tab over and I'm going to add what's called a line comment. This isn't a documentation comment. It won't actually show up in documentation that gets generated by those documentation generating tools. It's just a comment that explains to somebody who's reading this code what the next chunk of code is going to do. So I'm going to say I'm going to print a supportive message, and I'm still going to use the console.writeLine method. And as you can see, Visual Studio actually will give us selections as we go along. And this is really useful. It helps speed up how quickly we can write our code. I know I'm going to use console.writeLine, so I can press tab and tab, and now I can put what I want it to print out. And my supportive message will be hello noob. And as you can see, I have a red squiggly here at the end, and I'll turn on the magnifier, and I even get the error message that the compiler is complaining about, and it says a semicolon is expected. That's because it expects me to put a semicolon at the end of this line, so I'll do that. And now, if I want to build before running just to make sure everything compiles, and I'll tell you that if you don't have red squigglies, everything should compile. But if you want to check that, you can just build by either selecting build solution, or pressing F6. So I'll build, and down here in my output window, you can see I get a message that says build 1 succeeded. So building actually generates that common intermediate language that I was talking about before we started looking at the code. Now you might wonder how I knew how to use console WriteLine. And you'll find yourself regularly reading documentation so that you know how to use the methods that are provided in those namespaces that we include in our code with our using directives. So let's go take a look at the documentation. There are multiple ways that you can use help. I talk in the appendix of the book about how to set up your Visual Studio environment so you use local help with the help viewer, but you can also view help online. So let's take a look at the online help, and you can get to the online help at docsmicrosoft.com. When you're looking up help, you can either pick .NET, which will cover all of the .NET languages, or you can pick C#, and I'll pick C#. And up here in search, I'll look for the console class. When I do that, I get a bunch of hits, and I'll pick the first one. So the documentation for a particular class will talk about the class itself here in sort of the top level of the documentation. It also has sections talking about the properties for the class, and we'll talk about what properties are and how we use them when we look at classes and objects. We can look at the methods of the class, which is what we want to do here because we're trying to find out how the WriteLine method works in the console class. And we can look at events as well, but we don't need to worry about that for this particular example. So luckily, the methods for each class are in alphabetical order. We could learn how to make the console beep, but we're not going to bother with that. We're interested in WriteLine, so we can scroll down here and select WriteLine. Over here in this pane in the middle, we now see that there are lots of versions of WriteLine that we can use. And specifically, the versions differ based on what we actually pass in for information into the method. This is the version that we're using, and if you read the description, we see that it writes the specified string value followed by the current line terminator, which will just be a new line for us, to the standard output stream, which is the command prompt window. So we're going to call WriteLine passing in a string. And the way we pass in a string is here's the string that we want to be output to the command prompt window, and we put that string between double quotes. So that's how we pass a string into this WriteLine method. The last thing I want to point out is if I click on this, we can see up here that there's this special word called static. And what that means is when we call this method, we put the name of the class followed by dot, followed by the method name, followed by an open parenthesis. Even if we aren't providing any information, we always put an open parenthesis after our method name, and then whatever we're passing in, if we're passing anything in, followed by a closed parenthesis, followed by a semicolon. So I'll say it again, you will find yourself reading documentation all the time for as long as you program, so getting used to doing that is a really helpful thing. I'm going to Control F5 to run my code, and as you can see, it prints out what we expected. And that's all there is to creating our first console app in C#. I promised you that I would show you why I don't pick .NET 6.0 in the courses in this specialization when I create console apps, but as you recall, I picked .NET 5.0 to generate the project, but I might actually want the features that are available in .NET 6.0. So what I can do is, now that I've created my project, if I want those features, I can come over here to the project in the Solution Explorer and right-click it and select Properties. And one of the things I can change is the target framework. So I'm actually going to change my target framework to .6.0, and then I can just close that tab. And as you can see, it still runs exactly the same way, but now I have a project that actually is using this .NET 6.0 framework. Why did I do that instead of just creating a project with the .NET 6.0 framework? I'll show you. If I fire up Visual Studio and I create a new project and I say it's a C# console app and I say next, and I'll call this First Console App 6.0 and say next and select .NET 6.0 instead and create my project, this is the template that I get instead. And as you can see, it's much smaller. It just has the console write-line hello world that was provided in the body of my main method in the template that we're actually using. It turns out that when Visual Studio creates a .NET 6.0 project for you, I'm going to control-click this link. What it does is it actually hides all this stuff that we got in our template that we created. And there are some good reasons why it decides to generate that particular template, but I prefer in the beginning programming courses to have you actually see the full structure explicitly in the code, instead of having it sort of added under the covers. It's there but you can't see it. I think it's better as you learn how to program to actually not have any of the code hidden, to actually explicitly see it in the source code files you have. So that's why I create using .NET 5.0 and then change the target framework for the project to .NET 6.0 later. And that way we get a template that explicitly shows the full structure of our program class. To recap, in this lecture we saw how we can write our first C# console app in Visual Studio, and we'll use Visual Studio as our IDE throughout this course and the other courses in the specialization. I will provide all the code for exercises and programming assignments and so on in Visual Studio. For each lecture in which I generate code, I'll provide the code as a resource in that particular lecture.